So in the first part of this video, we're going to briefly have a look at the rendering workspace and look at some of the settings and options within the rendering workspace. But first up, we need an object to render. So in this case, I'm just going to do a cube. Nothing particularly complex to start with. Let's choose 100 by 100. Finish that up. And let's extrude that by 100, obviously to make it a cube. Perfect. So that's our cube. So let's drop into our rendering workspace. Lovely. So that's our cube as it is at the moment. We can move around that. The first up in our rendering workspace is to look at our scene setups. We will come back to appearances in a minute, but we can look at our scene settings window, and we'll work just down this box to see what they all do. So this is our brightness option. So this changes the brightness of our scene. So we can get different effects by just purely changing the brightness. We can change the position of that light. So just by clicking on this, we can see where our light sits and how that impacts on the shadow that we get from our object. You set that back to the default just by clicking reset. Then once you're done, just click back on this option here. We can select our background. We can choose between solid color and environment, and we'll touch on what those do in a minute. We can change our color. So we can change our background color and hit apply. We can go for something more red if you want. It's entirely up to you what you choose your background color. I'm just going to drop it back to roughly about the default there. You've got the ground plane option. So if we rotate around our object here, you'll see we've got a shadow. If we choose ground plane on and off, you'll see that our shadow appears and disappears. Then you've got options like flatten ground and reflection. So if I hit reflection, you'll see we're now starting to get reflections from our object as well, cast onto our ground plane. Obviously, if I turn that ground plane off, they'll disappear. You can also change the roughness of our surface or our notional ground plane by dragging the slider. And so you see that as you drag the roughness, it softens up reflections. I'm going to turn reflections on, but leave ground plane switched on at the moment. You can change the camera view, so you can change from orthographic to perspective as well. You can change the focal length of the camera, so any of you who've got a hobby of photography will know what these mean. You also select depth of field, and we can't really see this until we start doing our in-canvas render. So if we go up here and click our green button to start an in-canvas render, you'll see that it starts to ray trace this object, and you'll see we're getting our shadow effects for our object. If we just stop that a minute and we go to depth of field, we select which bit of our object we want to be in focus, and I think this front point. We can select a blur. Let's go 0.2 with a blur. We can hit in canvas render again. And it's maybe not particularly obvious here. Let's zoom it in a little bit. That we're starting to get the back of our object blurred out a little bit. We can maybe up this to 0.5. Hitting canvas render again. And you'll see there's a lot more blur happening outside of our center of focus. Gives us that more realistic look that you see in things like macro photographs. So that's an interesting setting to play with when you get more in depth into your rendering. We'll just turn depth of field off a minute and stop our ray tracing. You can also add environments as well. So we've got environments here. We're in a sharp highlights lighting environment at the moment. We can add photo booth, and that changes our lighting. Let's go back to sharp highlights for this really. I'll show you in the next portion of the video what some of these other options do and how we can use those to add different effects to our renders. So now we really want to drop into, now we really want to have a look at materials and what effect they have. So we can go to Appearance, or A on your keyboard. This will bring up this Appearance menu, and you've seen me and other people use this in previous videos. So we can use this to drop different materials onto our objects. So let's choose a simple glossy black plastic to start with. Also, we can hit up in Canvas Render and see what it looks like. You'll see we're getting some nice effects already here due to the lighting that we've got, that we get this different, so we get this different reflection on the top here. We'll get a different effect if we choose a matte plastic. So if we stop in Canvas Rendering and choose matte instead, you'll see we get a much different effect. We actually get a reduced reflection on our part. So choosing these materials does have an effect on the way your object will appear. So we just stop that. And let's go and choose something different so we can have a look through. There's loads of materials within this menu. This collapse all menu. Let's choose Other. Let's choose Carbon Fibre. If you see this logo on the right hand side, this arrow, it just means to download. So some materials you need to download before using. So you can drop this on. You can see that applies a carbon fibre texture to our object. You can hit Render again. You can see we can get this carbon fibre texture. It's a little bit dark, so maybe we want to boost the brightness of our scene. So go up here and maybe change the location of our light as well. And we'll close that. And hit in Canvas Render again. And you see we start to get these nice effects. So we'll drop back into our Appearance menu and we'll look at some other materials. So we can choose some metals. A whole host of different metals here. We can choose things like aluminium cast and drop that on. We might actually drop the brightness down for this actually. Close that one. And you'll see we get this rough effect that happens. I'm not going to let this complete its full ray tracing. You can do, obviously, just so you can get the full effect. I'm just going to carry on playing with different materials. So I'm going to hit A again. When you have materials applied, so you're here at the top, aluminium cast, you can double click on that material and change some of the properties. So you can change the scale of the texture. So you can see there that I'm getting this effect. I can change the scale of it. I can also change its rotation on an object. I can also change its apparent roughness as well. There are other options, so you can change the colour of it. So you can make it appear darker or lighter. So don't be limited necessarily by the material and the colour that it is. You can go in and modify the colour if you wish. So maybe we'll make it blue. There are other options under Advanced. So you see that to get this cast texture, actually we give it a relief image pattern, and you can change that image pattern as well. So you can create your own custom materials, and I'll show you briefly how to do that. And you can give it a texture, then you can control this, and that gives it that textured appearance on the surface or object. There are other things that you can change if you have a full custom material, but we'll get into that in a second. So we can cancel that. Let's quickly look at some of the other materials. So there are other materials such as woods. So we can choose a wood, and we can choose maybe oak and drop that on. And you'll see we can change the scale of our oak and get full wood effects. Again, we can change rotation, roughness and reflectance. There are other wood options. So for solid woods, we can go down here and we can choose maybe 3D cherry glossy and apply that. And you'll see we get these end grain effects as well. By clicking on our 3D cherry here, we can also change all of the effects of our wood. So we can change essentially the growth rings of our wood if we want to. We can add and remove pores. We can change the roughness of all our growth rings there. So it gives you real full control over the effects. Let's hit green for in-canvas render. You'll see we can render out this wood effect here. Let's hit stop. Let's look at some of the other materials. So if you look on the miscellaneous, for instance, you've got emissive materials, and you can actually select things like bulbs. So if we choose this 81 lumen white light, I might just turn down the lumens here. Hit done and hit in canvas render again. You'll see really it floods the scene with light. Let's go and drop this down even more. Let's drop it down and type in 1000. What happens there? That's better, we're dropping it back a little bit. So you see we're starting to not wash out the image and get the full effect of a light bulb essentially. We could probably tone it down even more. So let's go down to 250. Click on done. Hit green again. And that's even better. What you will find is you've put other objects in the scene, their appearance will change based upon the presence of an emissive light source. So let's go and do that. Let's go back to our design. Let's go and drop something else in our scene. Let's just choose that and pop that up. Perfect. Let's drop back into render. And then if we hit our in-canvas render again, you'll see that because we've got an emissive source, it's casting light onto our cylinder we've just created. So now then, if I go and boost the luminance of our object, let's put it back up to about 800. You'll see we get even more light cast onto our cylinder that we put in here. So other objects will respond to the materials you add. If we stop our in-canvas render and drop our wood back on, turn it back on again, you see we don't get that light cast onto our cylinder we've put there. But if, for instance, we're just going to drop a reflection or a mirror onto here, so let's close that down. Let's choose mirror. Let's choose that as a mirror. You'll see then we're getting our wood effect reflected in our cylinder we've put in here. We can move around our scene and re-render, and you'll see we're getting a perfect reflection of our cube here. So that's just a brief tour around some of the built-in materials in Fusion. You can add your own materials into Fusion as well if you so wish, and that can be done by going back into your design workspace and choosing modify and manage materials. From there you can create a new material, and there you can pop in all the properties that you want as well. So that just gives you a way to add new materials. So that's the first part of our video sorted. I'm giving you a quick tour around the rendering workspace. You've seen how to apply materials to objects. You've seen how to apply different appearances and how to set up a scene. Now we're going to look at a product and how we would render that and change some of the scene settings on that product. So let's head over to that file now. We'll go and take a look. In the second part of this video, we're going to look at rendering up a simple product. In last week's services video, Elliot chose an Xbox controller. I've gone for something more retro in this week's video. So this is what we're looking to achieve, is something not dissimilar from this. And when fully rendered up, it should look something like this. But to start off, I've given you a file where we have a simplified version of the SNES controller or Super Nintendo Entertainment System controller, just in a plain material. We're going to look at applying various materials and textures to this model. You'll note I've changed the home view in this, so every time you click on home, it'll take you back to this view, which is the one we're going to use for rendering. You've got all the components down the left hand side here, so we can turn them all off and turn them back on if we need to. It's a simplified version of a SNES controller, it's not the full version. It's just to use an example for our rendering purposes. So first up, we're going to jump into the rendering workspace like we saw with the previous part of this video. And this is what our design looks like. We can hit render now, and we'll get this rendered out just in our matte plastic. And you'll see we're pretty much there with the effects that we need. We'll let that render for a second just so you get an idea. There are a couple of effects I've already turned on at this stage. The main one being depth of field, and that's why we're getting this blur in the background but in focus at the front. And you can mess around with the levels of blur that you want to use. I've kept a solid colour background. We saw in the previous step how you can change that. I've also kept the standard position of a light, and I'm just using a sharp highlight environment. So we can close that. I'm going to start dropping on some materials. I'm going to start dropping on some appearances. So I'm going to hit A on my keyboard, which brings up this menu. And we're going to start dropping on appearances onto this model. It's up to you which plastics you use, but I'm just going to use the default glossy ones for the moment. So I'm going to find which buttons are which, and just drop these, on. So that's the blue one. That's the yellow one. We have got a reference image of a SNES controller on the middle page, which you can use. Now I'm going to drop on the green. So it's asking me if I want to change the appearances, as I've already applied a white matte plastic to these bodies. So it's just asking me if I want to overwrite that essentially, which I do. So there you go. And that's what we need. So you'll notice that this top body has been split up into faces. So if we drop back into design, you can see that I've actually used a sketch to split this face into different regions. And the reason for doing that is when we drop back into rendering, I can hit A again, and I can find a matte grey plastic. But rather than apply it to the whole body like that, I'm only going to apply it to just this face. So drop the matte white back on the body. I'm going to click on faces. I'm going to drop the matte grey onto there. I'm also going to drop that matte grey onto the directional pad. If we go back to bodies, because that's a separate body and component. I'm also going to drop it onto the start and select buttons as well. Perfect. If we look at the reference image though, this still looks a bit light in comparison to the final thing, so we need to change how dark this matte grey is. So if we go up here, we can double click on matte grey, and we can start messing around with what colour we want this to be, and that feels about right there, but you're free to choose whichever one you want. So that's that applied to there. I've not applied it to these faces obviously. I do want to give these buttons a bit more of a realistic look though, so what I'm going to do is find a matte black, and you will notice if I hide this body, there is an additional face underneath here, and so I'm going to apply that to that face. I'm going to do the same with the yellow and the blue and the green. Apply it to this additional face. It's one of the tricks you can use to make stuff look more realistic. If we go and drop those back on there, you'll see it looks like there's a gap around the buttons, which is what there would be in reality. We can go and do the same again around these buttons as well. Same with directional pad. That face I've put in there. And you can see pretty much instantly it makes it look more realistic because we've got this black background to our object, so it makes it look like there's a much bigger hole through the object. We need to add an appearance to our wire, so I think with that we'll choose a glossy grey. So we'll go and drop that on there. So we've got a glossy grey and a matte grey as well. So you can see we get that nice reflection in the glossy grey. Okay, we can test what that looks like. So we can hit home and in canvas render. You see we're already starting to get some nice realistic appearance coming out of this. We'll let that just render a little bit. One of the options you might want to choose when you're doing these in-canvas renders is if you choose in-canvas render settings, you can choose to lock view. So what that does, if I currently move the view, it will start having to completely restart ray tracing again. But if I hit lock view and OK, as soon as it started ray tracing, I can't move the view around, and so it won't restart if I try and move it, or if I move it by accident. So we'll let that render up quickly. That's already starting to look good. This feels a bit matte though here, so what I think we want to do is change this as well to a reflective grey. So go back into our appearance settings. I'm going to drop our plastic glossy grey onto this face as well. So select faces and drop it onto here as well. Again, I want you to make that a little bit darker. Hitting canvas render again. You can already see we're starting to get some nice reflections of the buttons in this face. Probably too much reflection though. We only want a tiny bit of reflection here. So we'll go in and modify this material again. So if we press stop, press A or go to appearance again, and it was our plastic glossy grey. What I'm going to do is drop the reflectance down a lot and up the roughness a little bit. Hit done and close, and hit in canvas render again. And you'll see we've toned down some of that reflection, so it's only just there, which gives it again more realistic appearance, but not artificial. You'll see we're getting these nice shadow effects at the bottom as well, and that comes because we have our ground plane switched on. So if I hit stop on in canvas render and go to our scene settings and turn off ground plane, you'll see that we lose all of these realistic shadows. So now if I hit in canvas render, it'll look like it's floating in space more than it's sitting on a surface. So I think we'll leave ground plane on for this because that'll make it look more realistic. Hitting canvas render again. You'll see this green spot here. This green spot is where I've set my center of focus to be for our depth of field. So if I stop and I set it to a high number, so if I go 0.5 and we hit in canvas render again, you'll see a lot more of my SNES controller becomes blurred out. So I think we'll drop it back to 0.15 because that seems about right. Perfect. Obviously there's no right or wrong way to render this. This is purely down to your taste. So if you want to change some of these appearances, you can do. This is just what I've chosen to start with. I'd probably actually change this white matte plastic a little bit just to make it a little bit darker. The one thing we are missing though is our decals on the front. So we can drop back into design, go to our top view, and I provided you with the decal of the logo, the SNES Control logo, and the select and start. So let's insert a decal. Let's go with the SNES logo to start with. So we're going to sit it on this face. Then we can move that about. Set the size. It's only approximate. Obviously you've got a reference image that I've given you, so if you want to make it more realistic, you can try and match it to our reference image. I think that's about right, so we click OK, and we'll do the same with the select and start. So insert decal and select and start. Again, we're going to apply it to that face, and I'm going to drop the size down a little bit and move it across. I think that there will look good, and click OK. Right, we go back to hit our home view, and we're going to go back into the render workspace. Lovely. It's looking good. So obviously that's just using in-canvas rendering. You can change the quality of the render by selecting it down the bottom, so I can change it to either excellent or final or infinite quality, or I'll just keep trying to do the ray tracing. If you want to do a quick rough in-canvas render, you can select that in your in-canvas render settings, so you can go and choose fast and click OK, and it will do a very quick almost roughing render to see, almost roughing render to give you an idea of what it will look like, but you're obviously not going to get out all of the proper blur effects at the back. So let's go back to our advanced. Again, I've left lock view on. Once you've got a render you're happy with, if you're doing in-canvas rendering, you can save that as an image. So you go to this one at the top, you can capture that and select what size you want, and you can export that out as a PNG. The other option is to use cloud rendering. So if we hit stop and we go to this teapot icon at the top, so cloud rendering will use cloud computing, so Amazon Web Services, to do the rendering in the background. So you can select what you want to create. I want to go for a high resolution image. Obviously you can select based on presets of where you want to deploy that image. I want to choose cloud renderer, and I want to choose final, so final quality. It says here it's going to cost 8 cloud credits. Don't worry about that. If you're a commercial customer, you would have to pay for this cloud rendering facility, but as an education user you get unlimited credits to do this kind of thing. So if we hit render, it will then put our render in the queue, and you'll get this note down the bottom to say cloud rendering has started. And what that means is that as soon as that notice comes up, the rendering happens in the background. If you want then to wait for the render to happen, you can carry on working while that renders in the background. We can drop back into our design workspace and carry on working. So that will carry on rendering for us in the background while we carry on working. If we want to check on the progress of our render, we can go back into our render workspace and choose this option at the bottom for rendering gallery, and we'll see we've got a render in process. So it was submitted 2 minutes ago. It tells us our image size, render quality final. If we click on it, it will tell you that it's in the render queue and it's going to take less than 10 minutes. We can cancel it or just let it carry on rendering. When it's finished rendering, what it's going to come up with is something like this. So it's going to come up with an image at the bottom, which you can then click on, It'll give you your rendered image. You can then change any of the attributes for that image, so you can change exposure value, presets, anything like that. You can also download your image or zoom in on your image as well, or share your image. So there is this option to render as a turntable as well, so we can click on render as a turntable. We can change our image quality. Let's go 6 frames and hit render. That will then start rendering as a turntable, and you'll see it's back in the render queue, re-rendering. We can go back and check on our original file where we started adding our appearances. That's still rendering. It's still less than 10 minutes, so we can carry on working while waiting for that to finish. As we saw in the earlier portion of this video, there are other things we can change in this scene. So we can mess around with some of our scene settings. So we can change our environments, so we can change our lighting, so we can maybe change it to a photo booth. You see that changes our shadows that we get. And hit in canvas render again, and we'll get a slightly different effect based on that lighting scene we created. Certainly gives us a much lighter appearance up the top here. You have some other inbuilt environments as well you can use, which if you just hit download, they should download and you can use them in your scene as well. We can drag those on. That's applied the lighting from our plaza, it hasn't applied the environment. So if we go to settings and then we change our background to our environment, you'll see now we've got our SNES controller in the plaza setting, which is an interesting place to find a SNES controller. So keep in mind that just applying an environment from here will just apply the lighting from that environment. You need to then select environment in your background as well. So I'll go back to solid color. You'll see I've still kept the lighting from our plaza. Go back to using photo booth. So again the same, I can go back to our settings and apply, go back and apply the environment as well, and you'll get this from our photo booth. So this is an environment based on our photo booth. So we can hit our home view and hit end canvas render again. And you'll get this photo booth effect for our rendering as well, which arguably makes it look even more realistic. So as you'll see, rendering is not particularly difficult in Fusion. Just dragging on a few materials and messing around with composition gets you some quite realistic effects quite quickly. It's one of those workspaces that you get out what you put in with it. So the more time you spend in the rendering workspace, the more features you'll uncover. So modifying materials, modifying their textures, modifying their reflectivity, modifying all different properties of materials will get you different levels of returns. So hopefully that was a quick and brief introduction to rendering. That's really shown you the workspace and shown you what you can do. So before we wrap up, we can go back and check on our cloud rendering jobs. So this is the file we've been working at where we started. Go down to the bottom and hit on rendering gallery and hit on the plus icon, and you can see now our cloud render is completed. And that's come out really quite nicely. We can download that and also link to it and zoom in if we want to. Perfect. So go back to the other file, the one I was working on originally. This one where we started our turntable render. So we can click on this, and now we can see the object has been rendered as a turntable. Also, you got the Y here that's moving around, but you can see some of the effects you could potentially achieve with this. So if you had objects that were cylindrical, actually put those in the centre of your work area. In quite an interesting way to show people all the way around your design. So we'll wrap up there. That's a very brief tour to dropping those materials on and change around with some of the scene settings to get a nice realistic render. The key really is to start practicing this workspace and just playing with different effects. Looking to see what the effects you can get out based upon playing around with the materials and all those lighting settings. So that's it from me for this video. Thanks for watching.